From Chicago studios, this is the Muslim News on Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum, I'm Samana, Siddiqui. First, the headlines. President Biden nominates the first Muslim woman to serve as a federal judge. Biden claims enormous progress in pandemic-blighted first year. Senate Republicans filibuster voting rights bill. UK asked to nab Indian Army Chief Home Minister over Kashmir war crimes. Kabul urges Islamic countries to recognize Afghan government. Our top story tonight. President Joe Biden on Wednesday nominated Nusrat Chaudhry to serve as a federal judge. She will be the first Muslim woman to do so. She was among the 8 judicial nominees announced by the president. Chaudhry currently serves as the legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois. She will be a U.S. judge in the Eastern District of New York. ACLU of Illinois Executive Director Colleen Connell said in a statement, Nusrat Chaudhry's nomination to the federal bench is historic as the first Bangladeshi American and first Muslim woman to serve on the federal bench and the second Muslim American. A defiant President Joe Biden acknowledged missteps Wednesday, but hailed a year of enormous progress on the U.S. economy as he took stock of his first year in office. In a news conference marking his first 12 months, Biden touted a period of unprecedented job creation, infrastructure improvements, and a growing economy. He said these would help counter inflation and supply chain woes plaguing his presidency.
Tomorrow will mark 1 year since I took office. It's been a year of challenges, but it's also been a year of enormous progress. We went from 2 million people being vaccinated at the moment I was sworn in to 210 million Americans being fully vaccinated today. We created 6 million new jobs, more jobs in 1 year than any time before. Yes, I'm confident we can get pieces, big chunks of the Build Back Better law signed into law. And I'm confident that we can take the case to the American people that the people they should be voting for who are going to oversee whether the elections, in fact, are legit or not, should not be those who are being put up by the Republicans to determine that they're going to be able to change the outcome of the election.
A special in-depth analysis segment is coming up later tonight in our show, so keep watching Muslim News. Far-right group The Oath Keepers were well prepared for a long siege of the U.S. Capitol ahead of the January 6, 2021 attack. Members of the group stockpiled weapons, ammunition, and supplies to last 30 days, according to new court filings from the government. These were stored in a Virginia hotel. The news came to light in a memo from the government to the court. 2 attempts by Democrats failed to pass a bill on voting rights Wednesday evening. Democrats needed 10 Republicans to vote with them to clear the 60-vote threshold to break a filibuster. They failed to achieve that. Then their attempt to temporarily weaken the filibuster rule to allow a majority to pass the bill also failed, as 2 Democratic senators, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, voted with Republicans to block that. The filibuster in an evenly divided Senate gives the minority party veto power over most legislation. After the vote failed, there was a loud round of applause from Republicans. The Senate GOP's obstruction Wednesday marked the 5th time that Republicans have filibustered voting rights legislation in recent months. The U.S. Supreme Court on Wednesday denied former President Donald Trump's attempt to block the release of White House records to a House of Representatives panel investigating last year's deadly attack on the U.S. Capitol. The High Court's 8-1 decision clears the way for the National Archives to share over 700 documents with the House committee. The documents include activity logs, schedules, speech notes, and 3 pages of handwritten notes from then White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. These documents could reveal goings-on inside the West Wing as Trump supporters gathered in Washington and then overran the Capitol, violently disrupting their certification of the 2020 vote. A group of rabbis, imams, and pastors helped FBI teams negotiate with a hostage-taker last week in a synagogue outside of Fort Worth, Texas. On Saturday, an armed British man with mental health issues took a rabbi and 3 congregants hostage at Congregation Beth Israel. The negotiating team included Bob Roberts Jr., Imam Omar Suleiman, Azhar Aziz, and Rabbi Andrew Mark Paley of Temple Shalom in Dallas. They set up a command center at Good Shepherd Catholic Community near the synagogue. Rabbi Nancy Kasten, speaking to Democracy Now! This week, said despite false media narratives describing the hostage crisis as an outgrowth of hostility between Muslims and Jews, the local Muslim community mobilized in support of the Jewish community this weekend. A London-based law firm has filed an application with British police seeking the arrest of India's army chief and a senior Indian government official over their alleged roles in war crimes in Kashmir. Law firm Stoke White says it has submitted evidence including 2,000 testimonies taken between 2020 and 2021 to law enforcement in the UK. These documents showed how troops led by General M.M. Naravine and Home Minister Amit Shah were directly involved in alleged war crimes and torture in the region. It claims the general and the Home Affairs Minister were responsible for kidnapping and killing activists, journalists, and civilians. It also accused 8 unnamed senior Indian military officials of direct involvement in war crimes and torture in Kashmir. The request to London police was made under the principle of universal jurisdiction. This gives countries the authority to prosecute individuals accused of crimes against humanity committed anywhere in the world. The international law firm said it believes its application is the first time that legal action has been taken abroad against Indian authorities over alleged war crimes in Kashmir. Some of the Indian officials have financial assets and other links to Britain. A group of more than 100 millionaires and billionaires on Wednesday presented fellow members of the global economic elite with a stark choice: it's taxes or pitchforks. The open letter was published amid the corporate-dominated virtual Davos summit. The 102 signatories included such prominent figures as Disney heiress Abigail Disney and venture capitalist Nick Hanauer. It warned that history paints a pretty bleak picture of what the endgame of extremely unequal societies looks like. For all our well-being, rich and poor alike, it's time to confront inequality and choose to tax the rich, it reads. The letter was released hours after an analysis showed that a modest annual wealth tax targeting the world's millionaires and billionaires would raise $2.52 trillion a year. It would be enough to lift billions of people out of poverty and vaccinate the world against COVID-19. The analysis was conducted by the Fight Inequality Alliance, the Institute for Policy Studies, Oxfam, and Patriotic Millionaires. The Israeli army on Thursday detained 7 Palestinians, including a disabled man. According to the Palestinian Prisoner Society, the arrest took place in the West Bank city of Jenin and Jerusalem. Eyewitnesses told Anadolu Agency that the Israeli army detained Abdul Qadir Khuzaima, who is in his 60s and disabled. The Israeli army often arbitrarily detains Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Over 4,000 Palestinians were held in Israeli prisons as of October 2021, according to the Prisoner Society. Afghanistan's Prime Minister Mullah Akhund, in a rare meeting attended by representatives of 20 foreign countries this week, called on the international community to recognize its government. He said Islamic countries should not wait and let the U.S. be the first to recognize Afghanistan, after which, he told them, you would also recognize it. He also urged the UN to release the Afghan Central Bank's $9.5 billion in assets, which it froze when the Taliban took control of the country in August. Akhund said the lack of recognition is creating severe challenges for Afghans in a variety of ways. Gambian President Adama Barrow was sworn in for a second term on Wednesday at ceremonies near the capital Banjul, the AFP reports. With the Quran in his right hand, he took his oath of office in the tiny West African nation. Barrow's first election in 2016 put an end to more than 20 years of dictatorship under Yahya Jammeh. The former property developer was re-elected in December, winning 53% of the vote. He was sworn in for a second 5-year term at a stadium at Bakau on the outskirts of Banjul. The ceremonies were attended by foreign VIPs that peaked with a 21-gun salute.
Proceeding from the transition phase, the Gambia will now need a new development model and new operational frameworks, with our development priorities set against sustainable timelines for implementation.
96% of the Gambian population is Muslim. The international community must act together to overcome the crisis in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Tuesday. Erdogan spoke during a joint news conference alongside his Serbian counterpart Alexander Vučić, referring to recent moves towards separatism in Bosnia. Erdogan said all parties must refrain from taking steps that harm the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina and act responsibly. He said this is key for peace and stability. Vučić stressed that Belgrade respects the territorial integrity of neighboring Bosnia and Herzegovina. He added that it is also important to remember the region's history and to learn from it. The Bosnian genocide between 1992 and 1995 killed about 100,000 people and displaced over 2 million. Now, Serbs in Bosnia are trying to carve out a separate country for themselves. Coming up next after the break is our in-depth analysis segment, so stay tuned, and we'll be right back after these messages.
If I could be you, and you could be me, for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds, walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes.
Despite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, millions around the world will not have access. We need a vaccine that's free and available to everyone, everywhere. It's time for a people's vaccine.
I am what hunger looks like in America. I am an 8-year-old girl who's not excited for the last day of school. Because this may be the last time I'll have lunch.
Till September.
I am a single father of 2 who works 3 part-time jobs, and that's still not enough to put food on the table. I was created by artificial intelligence from faces of the 1 in 8 Americans who struggle with hunger.
Feeding America, 200 food banks strong.
Dad, they took over my bedroom. Come on, come on. Okay, Dad. 1, 2, 3. Dad! You saved me. Dad?
Are you okay?
I'm fine, dear.
Your hero needs you now, and AARP is here to help. Find the care guides you need at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. To discuss President Biden's performance during his first year, let's go to Imam Abdul Malik Mujahid. Over to you, Imam Mujahid.
Thank you, Samana. President Biden is rating himself pretty high in dealing with pandemic and other issues, while on this same day, in the evening, Congress defeated the voting right bills. And it was not happy, but Republicans were clapping. This was 5th attempt by Democrats, which was defeated by Republicans. They tried to amend briefly for that movement, the filibuster thing. That did not succeed either because 2 Democrats joined Republicans in defeating that. How do you rate? And we will be discussing these things with a scholar who is a scholar of associate professor of economics at Denson and president of Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Dr. FADHEL KABUB. Welcome to Muslim Network TV. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you for having me back on the show.
Thank you so much. So how do you compare? I mean, people make a big deal about the first 100 days and all that. But when President Biden decided to give a long press conference about his first year, how do you compare it with President Trump's first year?
Well, it's a very interesting question, a very interesting comparison, looking at Trump versus Biden in the first year. If you remember President Biden, when he was candidate Biden during the campaign, he made it very clear that his agenda is to build back better, quote unquote, build back better. And we can assess whether we're building back better or building back the same. And number 2, he made it very clear during his campaign that, quote, nothing will fundamentally change. So it's about going back to a pre-Trump system as opposed to structurally and fundamentally changing the US economy and the US system. So what was the pre-Trump system? It was the Obama administration. It was the Clinton and Obama system that the Democrats have established. In terms of the first year of Trump, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It was devastating on so many levels, social, political, and on the economic front. But to assess Biden, he came in during a pandemic with the disastrous situation on the public health front, on the economic front. And his administration managed to bring in the vaccines on a much broader and rapid scale than the Trump administration. But now, a year later, we've stalled. We've stalled in the US in terms of getting higher vaccination rates. We've stalled on the global scale in terms of getting vaccine distribution to every corner of the planet, because we're not going to put an end to this pandemic as long as we leave pockets of the world and pockets within countries where new variants can develop and thrive and automatically spread around the world, like the Omicron variant that we're dealing with right now. So unfortunately, my prediction is that we're going to probably live with this pandemic for at least until the end of the decade, unless something fundamentally different happens on the global distribution of vaccines and really coordination on a global scale. And that's where really the Biden administration hasn't really accomplished much. And because of that, the ripple effect of not putting an end to the pandemic translates into economic and social consequences, by which I mean, as long as we have disruptions caused by the pandemic, we're going to have disruptions to the global economy, to the global supply chain, which means we're going to have inflation pressure points all over the system, globally in the US, that will continue to make certain products more scarce and allow for abusive market power to kick in for key players in the economy to take advantage of the pandemic. And the flip side of it is on the labor side, where workers now are part of what is known as the Great Resignation. Workers are not going to take the existing jobs. Building back better is not happening, in other words, are not going to take existing jobs if wages and benefits and working conditions are just as bad as pre-pandemic and worse with the effects of the pandemic. So I'm not very positive on the economic front, unfortunately.
But President Biden says he has created 6 million jobs, which has never been created ever.
Well, those 6 million jobs was due to the reopening of the economy. So a few of my colleagues and I actually did a recent study, a monthly jobs report, actually green jobs report that we've been doing since the beginning of the pandemic. And we're trying to assess whether the Build Back Better strategy is actually working and how likely is it to work in the future. And what we did is essentially to look at how green versus how extractive the new jobs are in terms of their impact on people, on the planet, and also in terms of financial returns for companies in the private sector. And what we found in the beginning of the pandemic, during the shutdown, is that all industries lost jobs. But what we found is that the greener industries were more resilient, meaning they lost the fewest jobs. And as we reopened the economy in the beginning of the recovery from the pandemic, greener jobs recovered faster than more extractive industries. Greener jobs were also paying better wages than more extractive industries. But as of this last month, for the first time since the pandemic, we found that the more extractive industries are now creating more jobs and recovering faster than the greener industries, are going to exceed the greener industries again, which means we're building back the same or not building back better in terms of pay. We're growing the jobs that pay the least in the economy, and we're growing the jobs that are less consistent with decarbonizing and having a positive impact on people on the planet. So we're growing back the same. And that brought me back last week when somebody asked me this question to Biden's quote, where he said, "Nothing will fundamentally change. It's not building back better, it's building back exactly the same as in pre-Trump economic system." And that's just not good enough for all the challenges that we're facing today.
So it seems you're saying that his promise of those two things were contradictory in itself?
Well, promises are promises. It's really actions that matter. So when you look at a strategy to tackle climate change and to decarbonize the system, if you're not tackling the abusive market power of the oil and gas industry, then you're not really serious about it. If you're not tackling climate change by having a coherent strategy that actually decarbonizes some of the most, the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in the US at least, we're not talking about the globe here. If you're continuing to support investments in oil and gas explorations, then you're not serious. For example, when we had a little bit of a fuss over gasoline prices over the last couple of months, what did the Biden administration say? They immediately called on the oil and gas industry to basically drill more and bring more supply to the market to lower gas prices. That's not building back better. That's building back the same. That's continuing the same thing. I'll give you an example just with some numbers so we know what we're talking about. The oil, the biggest oil and gas companies in the world, a lot of them are U.S., tied to the U.S. at least, if not U.S. based. Last year, collectively invested $500 billion, that's $500 billion, in capital equipment, in capital expenditures. If we're serious about climate change, and we know that the life on this planet depends on how quickly we decarbonize, and we're putting in place $500 billion more worth of pipelines and oil rigs and so on, then we're committing all of that investment to extract even more in the next 50 years. So it's one of two things. It's either that the investors who are putting their money on the table for those $500 billion and expect a rate of return over the next several decades, they're being duped because those investments will be shut down eventually as we become more serious about climate change. And that will be the equivalent of fraud. You're defrauding investors of those expected returns. Or we're not actually defrauding investors. We're actually serious about continuing to extract oil and gas for several decades in the future, in which case the $500 billion that were spent on oil and gas extraction infrastructure is the equivalent of a collective suicide pact for the rest of us on the planet. So whichever way you look at it, we're not taking this challenge seriously, and the Biden administration is not doing enough to tackle these structural problems. We're putting $500 billion more, which means we're committing ourselves deeper and deeper into the oil and gas extraction business.
Well, Professor KABOUB, one of the things which he also said, of course, he talked about handling the pandemic, economy and climate change, but also making country more equal. How do you rate him on that? Of course, his own grading is pretty high about what he has achieved.
Yeah, actually, one of the things that we discovered during the pandemic and the pandemic relief funding that was introduced last year, especially support for families with children, support for people who were displaced by the pandemic relief checks, all of those things actually improved people's quality of life during the pandemic and started to put a dent in childhood poverty, for example. And what did Congress do a year later? We didn't pass the bill that would have extended that kind of support to working families. So when we assess the Biden administration, it's really assessing the whole Democratic Party and their capacity to pass these bills. And unfortunately, it looks like that whole tendency has come to an end now that we have Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema both effectively siding 100% with the Republican Party when it comes to social spending, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to all of these policies that would produce a more equitable system. And then finally, I would say, if the Democratic Party and the Biden administration are actually serious about addressing the issue of structural inequality in the U.S., the child tax credit and all of these bits and pieces of social spending are helpful, but they're not tackling the abusive structural power that we've had in the system for decades. if we're not going after the oligarchy, so to speak, if we're not going after corporate power, if we're not enforcing antitrust laws, if we're not getting rid of corruption from the system, if we're not going after restoring the democratic process by making sure that our elected officials are actually a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs. And to me, that's not something that the Democratic Party or the Biden administration has been serious about. It's been a lot of rhetoric about small support, relatively small support for working class people, for the poor. And even that looks like is coming to an end. But in terms of going after the powers to be, there's no indication that's been the intention of the Biden administration from the beginning, or that's going to be the case in the next 3 years of his administration.
Well, so you are not much hopeful what he will be doing otherwise than next 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's really about listening to rhetoric and then following through with action. Anybody can talk about inequality, injustice, and poverty and climate change. We've heard a lot of talking about this stuff. It's the action that matters. Do you have a coherent strategy to make it happen? And unfortunately, the coherent strategy is not there on the table. And the votes, most importantly, the votes for the right policies doesn't look like the Democratic Party as a whole has enough members who actually agree with these issues to bring them to the table and pass this kind of legislation. And it's been very clear, as you mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, that even on basic democratic equity type of principles, the Democratic Party is not on board with the issues related to the filibuster, with voting rights. It's like we're back to the 1950s again.
Well, thank you so much, Professor KABOUB. I wish we can end on a better note, but back to 1950s.
Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, we have to be realistic about these things. I wish I had positive outlooks to highlight, but the important thing for me in terms of highlighting why things are not working is to really educate, inform, mobilize, and empower people with information. Because this is, if this is truly a democracy and the power is in the hands of the people, then we need to pay attention to what's happening and listen less to rhetorics and focus more on action. And if action is not there, we need to demand better action.
Well, thank you so much, Professor KABOUB, for your time. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.
Back to you, Samana.
Thank you, Imam Mujahid. That's all from our Chicago studios tonight. Thank you for tuning in. You can find previous episodes and more on our YouTube or Facebook. For more content, keep watching Muslim Network TV or visit muslimnetwork.tv. Salam and good night.